Listen up. There's no more excuses.
We're empowering those who want the hustle by exposing the status quo.
The days of ordinary are over.
It's time to crush mediocrity and start discovering your greatest potential.
Welcome to the Hustle Nation. To the Hustle Nation. To the Hustle Nation. To the Hustle Nation. To the Hustle.
Welcome back to another episode of the Hustle Nation podcast. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the power of daily habits and why you need to be developing some. The first thing I want to talk about is my journey of reading this year. Prior to this year, I didn't read a ton. I read a little bit here and there. And my wife, who reads probably 50 books a year or more, said to me, well, how many books are you going to read this year? And I said, well, I'm going to try to get to 10 books. And I didn't think anything of it, but there were some days like a Saturday or Sunday where I'd spend maybe 2 or 3 hours reading. And there might be a week that went by where I was busy, was traveling, stressed out, didn't want to read, and I didn't. But as I zoom out now, I'm at about 40 books, and I've taken plenty of weeks off. I crushed my goal, and I'm going to say on average, I've spent about 15 minutes per day because a couple of things, as we talked about in the prior episode, part of my goals were self-improvement and reading was important. So because it was a priority, I had to look at other things like watching TV, scrolling aimlessly through social media. I said, well, these things aren't important. Reading is important because it fills my cup. By filling my cup, it allows me to fill the cup of others. And it's expanded conversations I've had. It's done a lot of good for me. And so I've made it a habit to get into reading. Now, it doesn't mean I have to read every single day, but the goal was to get 10. And as I continued to read, I said, I really enjoy reading. I'm going to keep reading. I didn't know I'd get this far, but a really interesting thing happened. And someone said to me, they're like, I just don't have that kind of time. Like, I could never read that many books in a year. And I said, that's what I used to say. I used to think I couldn't read. And I used to make all kinds of excuses why I didn't. I thought I was too busy. And I said, you know what? What if it only took on average 15 minutes a day? Could you find that time? And the person said, well, I don't know. Probably, maybe. I'm not sure. Like very non-committal. And I said, could you make 15 minutes a day or 10 minutes a day? 10 minutes a day might get you to 15 to 20 books. Yeah, I suppose I could. Now that you mention it, that seems really reasonable. And I said, yeah, it is. Would you be willing to sacrifice, and it's really not a sacrifice, 10 minutes of aimless scrolling through things that do nothing but keep you up at night and cause anxiety on social media to do that? And could you set a goal of 10 books, which, by the way, you'd probably have done in about 3 to 4 months if that was the case? And they said yes. So when I think about daily habits and I think about transforming your life, this doesn't have to be committing hours upon hours to doing something different. Sometimes it's just a matter of making a small change. And guess what? A small change led to a pretty massive accomplishment. And as we record this, we're not even through the year yet. And I'm going to have 42 or 43 books read. Something I never thought was really even possible for as little reading as I do. So Dustin, let's talk a little bit about why do daily habits often outperform big sweeping changes over life?
So it's an interesting thing as we look at daily habits. There's lots of content out there, books written about, what it takes to make a habit stick and all this sort of stuff. And there's a lot of good information out there. Don't get me wrong. I think there's a few things, and you've kind of touched on some of them. When I look at not only how do you make them, but actually what is the power of them? Because I think a lot of times people use the discussion around habits as a way to kind of just critique themselves on things that they're not achieving without really a clear plan on how to do it. Right. And so like to your point of books, right. It wasn't, if that wasn't a priority to you, you wouldn't make the 15 minutes. right? But because it's tied to your why, because it ties to a goal you have, right? It's a very simple behavior that you can try to that makes it easier. But what I really think is interesting about daily habits, I actually think there's two things that are so powerful about them that most people underestimate. But before I get to those two, I think there's an interesting, call it semantics, but if we look at daily habits versus daily commitments. So a daily habit means it's just second nature, right? You wake up, you brush your teeth. It's just a habit. You don't even think about it. It's on autopilot. And I think a lot of times when people trying to start a quote unquote new habit, that's the way they think about it. And I think that's why it's so hard, because they're thinking about it like, how do I make this so I don't need to think about it anymore? Well, you had to think about it for a long time. And, there's some people that say it's like 20 some days. Some people say it's 60 some days. I don't know what the data is. I'm not a scientist for that, but here's what I do know. I do know if you shift from a mindset, it's a daily commitment you have as opposed to a daily habit. That commitment can become a habit a lot easier because that commitment is tied to your vision. It's tied to a behavior that's going to drive to your goals and drive to your vision. Now it makes a little bit more sense. And so if you start every day with, okay, here is a daily commitment that I have. What is the power of that? Well, the cool thing about that is there's two powers. So one is the ability to fail with little consequence. So most people, when they do goal setting, they're setting it out for the year. And, we talk about someone, wants to run a mile a day for every day of the year. They get to May, they miss a day, they get injured, whatever. And then what happens? They just stop. Now they could probably do it again in June or July, but they just stop. They wait until January because they're like, oh, I want to start the challenge again. And so it's that, kind of falling off the wagon that actually hurts you, versus if you just hop back on, it will allow you with very little consequence to fail. So if you have a daily commitment that, let's say it's something you've never done before. I have a daily commitment to read 15 minutes a day. And that's just not part of your days today. And you miss a day. Who cares? Like, nothing's going to happen. You're not going to lose an appendage. You're not going to lose your life, right? Like, nothing is going to happen. But what is going to happen is if you miss that day, and then because you missed that day, that eliminates your daily commitment for the following day, to the following day, to the following day. And let's even imagine you missed 5 days in a row. So what?
Right.
Just get back on the wagon. There was a woman that I had the privilege of meeting who was actually on the show from previous years of The Biggest Loser, where they go on and they lose an absolute ton of weight, really change their health in a very dramatic fashion. And I remember talking to her about a year later, and she had kept the weight off. She was in great health. And I said, what really changed? Like, how did you kind of change that mindset? And she said, what I just realized is it's not about whether I'm going to fall off the wagon, because I will. I'll screw up again. It's just, I realized I just got to get back on faster. And so if I just, rather than it taking a month to get back on, I get back in a week or a day. That's all that mattered. And, to me, that really resonated. And so that ability for a daily commitment, you have the ability to fail with very little consequence. And so therefore you don't need to blame and shame yourself, which therefore means you can get back on. The second is the compounding effect. And we talk about this a lot with investing, right? If you invest a penny today, a penny tomorrow, and you add it up, it can add up to millions of dollars years later. And what do we know? We know that in a week of doing that, you don't have anything. In a month of doing that, you still don't really have much. Maybe even in a year, but 2 years, 3 years, all of a sudden there's this compounding effect that's just so dramatic. And that's really the power of the daily. And again, I think a lot of people think the daily habits, like, yes, if I stopped, brushing my teeth every morning, can you miss it for a day? Yeah. My teeth aren't going to fall out if I miss it for a day. Can I miss it for a couple of days? Yeah. Somebody might not want to be around me, but I could still pull it off. Right. But if I stack that up over 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, like, I'm not going to have any teeth left. Right. Not to mention the other health impacts. And so how do we reshift our mind to say, what is the daily commitments that are those behaviors that will make the most leveraged positive impact to drive to the goals that matter to me most?
Yeah. When you say that, the thing that I think of is exercising. And you made a really good point about failing. And I know people like me, I don't feel that way for one day because I know that things are going to happen where, you're going to get sick. And we're not talking about like the common cold. You might really feel like hell and you may not want to work out, or maybe you don't feel like you can work out for 3 or 4 days. That's okay. You could still zoom out on the year and say, I worked out 325 days of the year. That would be a massive success. Even to say you did half of the year would be a massive success. But I've also done this where, I'm not a super early bird. I'll wake up, and if there's a day where it's like, you know what, I'm not feeling well or I'm tired, I just had something going on where I only have about 15 minutes. I could go downstairs, hop on my bike, get a quick 15-minute ride in, and I could still zoom out at the month or still zoom out at the year and say, oh, wow, I fulfilled my commitment 85% of the time. Now, were some of them 1 hour workouts? Yes. Were some of them 10-hour workouts? Yes. But on average, it was a half hour, massive success. And that puts me probably in the 5-10 percentile of people who exercise. And I can feel really, really good about that. So I think for me, it's not about perfection. It's about the power of consistency, and that it's okay. And that we need to give ourselves grace, because I truly believe this, Dustin. I think there is no such thing as perfect. And I think striving for perfection is part of the problem, because a lot of times it robs us from taking action. It robs us from progress. And that is another thing I see so often, Dustin, is people look at all of this and maybe they're working on their 2020 vision guide or not. And they say, you know what? I work 50 hours a week, or I work 60 hours a week. And you start to audit it, and it's not so much habits. It's just that they're in constant motion, and it's the wrong things. It's not the daily habits they've created that align with their vision guide. They're just taking massive action.
It's so true. I mean, don't confuse motion with progress, right? And we see that from so many people where, and we all fall into it because we lie to ourselves, right? Like we don't really realize where we're spending our time, energy, and effort. And it's not until we really take a step back and think through what is the daily commitments? What are the things that I actually should commit to? Versus what are the things that might just come my way? And I'm okay when they come my way, but I'm going to make sure I make a priority of these things. Not everyone can do this, but I know Alex Hormozy had talked about this of, he just takes his most highest leverage things. He doesn't do anything other than that before noon every day. Now, he's a massive success, so you can't argue with the concept. I don't know if he was able to do that when he was first, launching Gym Launch. I'm sure he was not. But the point is still the same. It's when you find the most high leverage activities, get those done first. Whatever those daily commitments are, I think a lot of times people try to spread them throughout the day. And what I've seen is, and we've done this with our planner and all that sort of stuff, right? Like when you set up your stack of like, okay, what would make this a successful day? Here's the 3 things that I could do today that are my daily commitments, that high leverage, drive to my goals, make the most impact. When you get those done, the whole day's better. You create a momentum. You get that hit of dopamine, right? It's that measure of success. It creates momentum for so many other things, because we all have things that come at us. We all have, things throughout the day that pull us away. That'll never change. But if we have those very critical actions, then we're actually making progress towards it. Because one of the things we've seen, Chris, we've seen this time and time again, right? A lot of people even talk about the word hustle, and they associate it with the word burnout. And we talk about this a lot because I totally understand why it happens. Because if you're having a tremendous amount of hard effort, but you're not making progress, that is the definition of burnout. People don't burn out when they're kicking butt. when they're just achieving goal after goal after goal after goal after goal, like those people never burn out. Like, I mean, you're constantly running. So when you're on the hamster wheel where you're just cranking, and maybe you actually are making progress and you're just not seeing it, or maybe you're just not making progress because you're focusing on the wrong stuff. And how do we be real with ourselves, get that into a process so that we can actually focus on the most high leverage, high impact things that are actually going to allow us to achieve our goals?
Well, Dustin, that's the thing I see so much talking to. Usually, the smaller the business, the more burnout there is. They're too busy working in the business and not on the business. They don't have the right priorities. Therefore, they often don't have the best habits. And so that brings me to my next question, which is, there are a lot of folks out there with bad habits. There are some folks that don't really have habits. They just need to create some positive habits. So rather than and feeling overwhelmed, what are some ways they can get out of their old ways and build some new habits?
So I think the first thing, in order to make it sustainable, you have to have it tied to your why, because if it's not really core to what you really want to accomplish long-term in your life, you're just not going to be committed to it. And then why waste the time, energy, and effort? But I think beyond that, right, if you're looking for, this is a new habit I want to take, right? Whether it be exercise, whether it be, making, 15 outbound call attempts in the morning, whether it be, reading books, fitness, you name it, right? Whatever the thing is, doesn't really matter. Don't focus on it being the biggest, most audacious habit. It could start with the smallest thing. So one of the examples I've shared in the past is if you just walk into a gym. Now, a lot of people will be like, really? Like, that's going to be your behavior? That's going to be a goal? You just walk into a gym? I'm like, yeah, because what do we know? If you actually get your butt out of bed, you get dressed, you walk into a gym, could you literally walk in and do nothing and walk back out? You could. Human behavior is you're not going to do that. Now, to your point earlier, maybe you don't have a lot of time. And so maybe you end up, doing kind of a partial workout. Well, so what? You showed up, you had some success. You're better than you were before. And you've started to build that into your routine, right? You started to see how that works. Because a lot of times the reason we can't build new habits is we have these other quote unquote competing priorities that aren't really competing like we think they are. So I'll give you a great example of one that I went through. So I work out most mornings, right? I'll probably do maybe 3 or 4 times a week, depending on the week. And then my son, who's now 15, wants to work out in the morning. So as we're talking about it, I'm like, okay, well, he wants to work out 5 days a week, all during the work week, right? He wants to take the weekends off. I like to work out on the weekends because I have, less going on. But guess what? If I tie it to my why, one of my whys is to be a present father. It's not hard for me to get up for that ever, because it's tied to my why. It's a clear behavior, right? And now I've committed to it because of that. Versus candidly, if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be doing it 5 days a week. I mean, I've committed to my why of just long-term health. And so the 3 to 4 is sustainable for me, but I'll be candid during the work week. I mean, 1 or 2 is usually about what it is. And then I make up for it on the weekend. But now with him, it's totally flipped. And so if you tie that to your why, you get really clear on it and you make it reasonable and attainable, right? So even for the workouts we had, right? And I feel bad for kids these days because there's so much information out there. And I feel like so many times when people are trying to accomplish a goal, some younger individual, whether it be fitness or anything, everybody makes it so stinking complex. Like, I'm going to use fitness because it's just the easiest one where everyone's laying out, well, you need to do these 17 exercises in this order and this many sets and this, like, you know what? What if you just walk in and lift stuff up and set it down? Just go do something, right? Like that. And again, I'm not saying that you can't optimize it, but I think a lot of times people are focused on going from 80% effectiveness to 100%. They're focused on that last 20%. And so therefore they miss the 80% of it versus, what's the biggest thing? Just show up, just show up and do something. And if you do that, then you start to build the habit, you start to build the momentum. And so like to your point of the reading, right? Like, when you started it, reading for 15 minutes a day was probably pretty hard. Now that's probably not hard at all. And it doesn't mean you don't have to think about it. It doesn't mean you don't have to make a commitment to it, but now it's just, your family's used to it. You're used to it, right? If dad's sitting there reading a book, it doesn't throw the system into haywire, which by the way, I guarantee you when you started it, if your kids were around, your wife, like, it was like, what are you doing? Right? Like, because that's what happens. Right. And anytime anyone starts a new habit, your environment is used to you doing a certain thing a certain way, whether that's other people or yourself or whatever. And so how do you realize that that's going to happen? And it's not because anyone's trying to hold you down or anything. It's just like, wait, you're getting up at 5:30 in the morning to go work out. You've never done that. Well, that's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So
One of the things I look at too is, especially if you're a parent, is modeling. And I think it's so important to model good behaviors, more importantly, good habits. So whether that be exercising, and all of a sudden your kids see, well, I guess fitness is important to mom or dad, then they take an interest in it. And then best case scenario, it's a priority to you. They want to do it with you, which then allows you to check another box, which is, I'm not only a good influence on my kids, but I'm spending time with them, quality time. And that's something that my son, or your son in this case, will always be able to look back and say, when I was in high school, some of the most impressionable moments of our life, my dad and I got up every morning, we worked out together. He's not gonna remember that week that you took off or those 3 days you were out of town a couple times a year. He's gonna look back and say, almost every day throughout my junior and senior year, my dad and I worked out.
mm-hmm.
I mean, that's unbelievable. So I'll say this, like, if any of that sounds interesting to you, this is something I've said for a long time, is if it's a priority to you, it'll be on your calendar. Or in this case, as we talk about a lot, Dustin, it'll not only be in your 2020 vision guide, it'll be in your daily planner. And if it's not a priority. And so if it is a priority, not only will it be written down and documented multiple times, but you will not find time, but you will make time for it. And through the course of years or months, probably in my case, like with reading or working out, oftentimes 15 minutes a day doesn't even feel like enough, especially with a workout. But I still zoom out and say, I got it in. I wasn't feeling good, but I did it anyways. And that's important to me. So it's a priority. It's a habit. And I don't like breaking those habits now that I've built them. I wish I would have done them years ago. And here's the other thing, Dustin. I think maybe one of the final points here is when we talk to people about this, and I had them, I know you certainly had them, I think it's really important to identify the hurdles, which are ultimately bullshit excuses, preventing you from building the daily habits. And you'll find this in the 2020 Vision Guide, but there's a place to write them down, specifically as it relates to each goal. What are the hurdles, the things that you've either said that's BS, or the things you think that might be preventing you from achieving the thing that you want? What were some of your BS hurdles?
Well, I mean, there's probably too many to list even in the episode, but one of the most common ones, right? So everyone says time, which time is a BS one. And it doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of competing priorities for time, but it's because we have competing priorities. If it was the most important thing for you, you would do it. I was at an event recently, and a really sad story where actually a father lost his son. And, this guy was a business owner, really successful, a great community leader. And the day he found out that his son was gravely sick, guess what? He didn't show up to work, right? I mean, suddenly the business was able to run without him. And that doesn't mean I just think that you should just stop showing up for work. That's not the point. But, the point is suddenly his priorities shifted really aggressively, really quickly. And so he suddenly had time for it. And now, certainly that you don't hope you have that situation. But the point being is we always have time to do stuff. It's just, what are we going to spend the time doing? And a lot of times we're wasting time on stuff that we think matters, but doesn't. And I'll give you a great example. When I was going through this maybe 7 or 8 years ago and having this conversation with my wife, I was intentional about, I would come home from work and I would sit on the couch with her and we would watch TV. And now I would have my laptop up and I would be working the entire time. But in my mind, I was making time for her. Now, I was not efficient in that time, right? Like it was totally inefficient. I was half working and half with her. And so she had no interest in it, right? I thought I was doing a good thing,
Shocker.
right? And again, you look back on it, you're like, well, that's stupid. But we do that stuff all the time. We're half in. Everyone thinks that we can multitask. No one can multitask. It's impossible. You can task jump, but you can't multitask.
Right.
And more often than not, what's happening is we haven't actually prioritized it. Versus if I would have just realized from a prioritization perspective, one, close the laptop. Okay, that's the easy one, right? Or what if it was, you know what, I have to get these things done. So I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna go into my office. I'm gonna do an hour of this stuff so that I can get this thing done. And then I'm gonna come back and I'm actually have real time together, right? Which is now the way we live, right? But I didn't know that at the time because I wasn't thinking through what am I actually spending my time on and what's really the most important piece. But it was an excuse, right? I didn't have the time. But sometimes there's other, the most basic things. We are creatures of habit. I've shared this one with many people in the past. For me, for exercising, I have to have everything laid out the night before. It's stupid. It's complete. I mean, everything is right there. There's no reason not. But if I just lay out my shoes, my socks, everything I need laid out right there, right, just basically right outside my bed on my way to go to the bathroom, I have to walk past it. And I have to, which then reminds myself of that morning, I made a commitment yesterday to do that. I can do that. I should do that. Versus when I don't, I lie to myself. I'm like, I got a lot of stuff at work to do. I just got to go. Right. And so now that's an excuse. To your point, it's an absolute bullshit excuse. I'm weaning myself off, trying to wean myself off of it. But the idea was I just was real with myself. Like, okay, this is a cue that I can do that. Yes, it's a bullshit excuse, but it's going to allow me to be prepared to think, get my mind right to do it. And the reality is we're human. We're fallible people by nature. What are the ways we can, in many ways, almost trick ourselves into how do we make it a priority? How do we make the time? How do we eliminate these barriers? And then the last thing I'll share is there are some times where they're actually real barriers. Like there is the possibility to be a real barrier, but it always comes down to, unless it's a physical thing, it's always a prioritization thing. And so as an example,
Agreed.
At one point I was having a conversation with actually a coach of mine, and I was talking about just not having the time to do certain things that I had committed to doing. And the realization came as at that time I was on like 4 different nonprofit boards that was taking up hours of time every single month. And he's like, so how does that fit for you? And I'm like, well, I want to give back to the community. He's like, okay. So first of all, how impactful are you actually for all 4 of those? Like what happens if you just left? Like what would happen? Literally 3 of them, I wouldn't say they wouldn't have noticed, but they wouldn't have noticed. Like they would have just continued to operate. Mission would have still been fulfilled. It would have been fine. There was one I was more heavily involved in. And that in my head, I was like, well, that one I can't. Like that one, I'm too heavily involved. And they're like, okay. So 2 years ago, they functioned as an organization. 2 years from now, you'd like to think they're going to function as an organization. What makes you think that you're so special that you're the only person that can get them to the right? And it was true, right? And now again, the answer wasn't the same for all 4 of them, right? For 3 of them, it was like, all right, these 3, they've got to go because I'm not even being good for them. The last one, it was like, all right, I just have to be more real about what my commitment actually is. But the point is that I if you would have asked me, I would have said it was time. If you would have said I wouldn't have had the time, I wouldn't have had the time. But what it actually was is I was misprioritizing things that I didn't even realize I was really spending much time on.
Great point. And I think it's important too to note that you want to set yourself up for success because there are a lot of people that self-sabotage, or just in general, they might not be doing that, but they might not be doing the best they could to set themselves up for success. So in your case of working out, you weren't self-sabotaging, but there were things you could have done to make it easier. And we're all going to have those little nuances or quirks, if you want to call them that, where, yeah, is it helpful? Yes, it is absolutely helpful, because if you have a spouse, you don't want to set an alarm at 5 a.m. or turn the lights on and wake that person up. Like, that's disrespectful. So what are the little things you can do? And you could write them down. There's probably 2 or 3 of them that say, hey, I could go to bed 15 minutes earlier. That's not a big ask, right? That'll help you get up early. You could lay your stuff out. There's a lot of things you could do. Have your water bottle filled up, ready to go. So I think it's really important to do that when you are journaling. And that would be my final point of this episode, is that some people set themselves up for success and they're able to achieve their goals because they're journaling their daily habits. Or the way we like to do it, Dustin, is through not an actual journal, but a daily planner. We use our Hustle Daily Planner, which we'll talk about later on in this series. But to me, it's important because it amplifies your daily effectiveness. You're writing them down not just once a month, not just here and there, but you're jotting them down intentionally as a reminder. Because here's what I always say. If you win the days, you win the week. If you win the weeks, you win the month. And if you win the months, you're going to win the quarter, and it's inevitable. You are going to crush the year. And so documentation is key, but do it with intention. Whether you have our journal, whether you use a notebook, I would argue that a notebook is not good enough. I think if these things are really important to you, you will take this to the next level. And so I'm going to wrap this up and just say, again, if you're resonating with this stuff, I implore you to check out our 2020 Vision Guide. We'll certainly have links to the daily planner as well. But to get this far, to have a vision and to establish daily habits, even just to identify what are the right ones, because it's going to take time to create 2 or 3 new habits. And I don't know that you should even try to do that. I think one at a time, or maybe 2 small habits that you can implement into your calendar, into your routine with ease, is important. Setting the right bar, not raising it too high, not setting it too low to where it would take nothing for you to do that. Somewhere you're going to feel like you're really stacking victories is important here. So check it out. Thanks for tuning into another episode. We'll catch you on the flip side. Peace.
Thank you for being part of the Hustle Nation. If you're serious about raising the bar in your personal and professional life and willing to go all in on your success, head over to hustleleaders.com. Here you can get access to our Hustle Productivity ebook, attend our Hustle Masterclass, or challenge yourself to the 30-day Hustle Challenge. Pairing these tools and training with the Hustle Nation podcast will help you advance to a whole new level. Until next time, stay hungry and inspire those around you to hustle.